I've never posted on Reddit before, but my friend and I were reminiscing the other day, and it occurred to me that some of you may be interested in this stuff. I'll just get right into it. My dad loves camping. Actually, my dad's entire side of the family is very outdoorsy. It's never really been much of my thing, but I do have a soft spot for camping since we've grown up camping pretty much every single summer. Ever since I was about 8, we've gone camping on an island out in a large lake located about 6 hours from my hometown. I won't specify exactly where, but I will say it is in the US. Honestly, I feel like we're probably all insane for continuing to come visit this place year after year, even after the weird shit we've seen. But it's otherwise a really fun place to camp. Aside from literally everything I'm about to tell you, it makes for a great vacation spot. Very secluded and relaxing. Originally, we were a small group. Just me, my brother, and dad, my dad's best friend, and his son, and a good friend of mine, since my dad figured little 8-year-old me wouldn't want to be stuck with a group full of boys all weekend. Over the years, the 5 of us have continued going, but our numbers have grown. Now, we usually end up with a group of up to 9 or 10 people, comprised of family members and other close friends. We've been camping on this island every summer since we were kids, for the past 11 years. It wasn't a pre-existing tradition either. My dad just decided one day that it would be a great idea to pack up, live in the woods on an island for a week. He turned out to be right, and now we're here. By this point, we all know the place practically as well as our hometown. 2 years ago, my family actually bought a little cabin on the island, which we use often in the summer and rent out to other visitors when we're not occupying it. Point being, we've been visiting this island for nearly as long as I can remember. As much as I love this place, there is some weird and unexplainable shit that goes on out there. The following events are just some strange things that have happened to me and my friend, who we'll call Violet, throughout the years. But I do plan on asking my fellow island visitors if they've had any weird or creepy experiences during any of our trips. The first one happened either the first or second year that we headed out to the island for the weekend. The campsite we frequent is set right on the water, so that some of the sites even face out over the lake. Our campsite was set a bit further back, but was still within easy walking distance of the lake. So the 4 of us kids would spend most of the day in a constant loop, from campsite to lake, and back to the campsite again. Another thing about this campground, it was empty almost every single time we stayed there. There were a couple years where 1 or 2 other groups would be there at the same time as us, but it was rare. In hindsight, we probably should have taken that into consideration before setting up camp there year after year. It was a very bare bones campground. 2 outhouses, and a shed full of logs parked near the entrance. 1 water pump alongside the path to the beach. Some of the sites were even overgrown with tall grass and bushes, to the point where there was nowhere to actually put the tent. Anyway, on this particular day it was sunny, so everyone was parked out on the beach with their towels and a cooler full of cold sodas. It was early afternoon, and Violet and I had been sent back to the campsite to grab a second cooler, which was packed full of snacks for lunch. What I remember vividly isn't our walk to the campsite, but the walk back to the beach. There's a dirt road that winds all the way through the campground, leading to each individual site, and which eventually wanders all the way to the beach. Violet and I were walking that path, just rounding the bend so that the bank of the tall grass just before the beach was visible a little further ahead of us. We must have been talking, because I remember her suddenly motioning for me to be quiet. We slowed to a stop, gradually. The kind of stop you do when you know something isn't right, but you aren't quite ready to think about it yet. We stopped in the middle of the path, in broad daylight, and gave each other confused glances. My arm started to ache, so I set down the cooler. Something about the air in that moment, our sudden silence, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It took a moment for the realization to set in. As I mentioned, this campground was tacked right on the edge of the island, so that the lake was pretty much audible at all hours of the day. It had been especially loud today, with a strong south wind stirring the waves into a bit of a frenzy. So much that the sound had eventually faded into the background like white noise. The sound of the waves hadn't disappeared. but it wasn't coming from the lake ahead of us. It was coming from the woods to our left. I remember the feeling of dread when that realization struck me. It was as if all of the moisture was sucked from my throat as my stomach shrank in on itself. The sound itself was almost perfect. The wet slap of the waves against the rocks, followed by a bubbling, frothing, hissing as the water crawled backwards before being stirred into another wave. Crash, hiss, repeat. But it was too wet, which doesn't even make sense because it sounded like a lake, so of course it was wet. But I just remember thinking that it sounds wet. Not wet like water, but more organic. What should have been the crash of waves against rocks sounded more meaty, like a bucket of water thrown on someone's bare chest. Hollow and raw. The hiss was wrong too. It sounded too breathy. It sounded like breathing. Like something trying to imitate the sound of the lake with heavy, swampy breaths. I think Violet and I both realized this at the same time, because when I jerked around to look at her, her eyes were as wide and panicked as I imagined mine must be. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, something exploded out of the bushes directly to our left. It moved so quickly that neither of us got a good look at it. All I know is that whatever it was too big to be a rabbit, but too small to be a deer. But it had antlers, and it moved like nothing I've ever seen before. If you've ever watched an old, scratched-up DVD, think of how the character moved around when the DVD is skipping, but not quite frozen. Kinda jerky and glitchy, jumping from place to place, but leaving a trail of pixels whenever they move their limbs. It moved like that, but without the skips that come in between. Just really distorted, twisted steps. I swear I saw the thing's insides as it wrenched its way across the path. Its mouth was shuddering open and shut like a fish. We were frozen for about 3 seconds after it disappeared into the trees on the other side of the path. After that, we just took off for the beach without saying a word. When we tried to tell my dad and Drew, my dad's best friend, what had happened, they both told us that it was probably a deer. It was not a fucking deer. Violet and I still talk about that sometimes. I think that was our first instance where it occurred to us that this may not be an entirely ordinary island. By now, we've reached a consensus that it definitely isn't an ordinary island, but we've been going for so long that it's sort of become that, well, this might as well happen mentality. The next one I'll tell you happened 2 years after that, when I was around 10. As I mentioned earlier, the campground barely even qualified as a campground. I mean this in the nicest way possible, because I loved that place, but it was fucking terrifying to walk around there at night. Weird rabbit deer creatures aside, the place was pitch black after 9 o'clock, and as a kid, the thought of walking to the outhouse alone was unfathomable. One of the outhouses was located, and I'm not joking, in the middle of the fucking woods with no path actually leading to or away from it. Yeah, we'll get to that later. And the other one was parked on the edge of the circle drive that sat right in front of the beach. So, I'm 10, and I'd rather suffer the whole long night than walk to that cobwebby outhouse by myself now that it's dark. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could, try not to wake Violet, and padded across the campground to the fire, where my dad was still drinking a beer. As far as I can tell, Drew had already retreated to his tent with his son, and my brother was passed out in the tent that he shared with Dad. Dad walked with me to the outhouse and waited for me outside. One thing I should note about the outhouse: opening the door and coming out, you can see directly across the dirt circle drive to the path that leads to the bank of tall grass and down onto the beach. I keep saying beach, but I mean that in the same way that someone who says outhouse means clean, pleasant restroom. The beach at this campsite was rocks, not even pebbles, just straight up 2 miles of rocks. You had to wade a good 15 to 20 feet out into the water before you would hit sand that wasn't painful to walk on. So I opened the door, and the first thing I saw was a tall figure standing at the mouth of the beach path. It took a second for my eyes to get used to the darkness, but then I recognized it as Drew. I remembered being confused for a moment, because I'd been sure that he was sleeping. a feeling of realization dawning a second later. Drew was, and still is, a practical joker. One of his favorite pastimes during these camping trips is to see how many times he can scare us kids completely out of our skin. So I thought, oh, hey, he's gonna loop around and hide on the path and scare me on my way back. Hilarious. At the time, I didn't think about how impractical it would have been for him to come all the way down to the beach and then loop back when he could have easily just gone and hid in the bushes along the path while I was using the bathroom. I mean, give me a break. I was 10 and probably thinking about Harry Potter or something. Figuring I might as well let him know that he'd been seen, I waved at him and rolled my eyes exaggeratedly to say, "Nice try." Instead of waving back, he tilted his head slowly to one side as if confused. He lifted a limply hand into the air, but didn't wave it. Then he smiled and turned, his hand still raised, and walked up the path and out of sight. By now I had a weird feeling in my stomach. I asked my dad if he and Drew had been planning a joke on me, but he said that Drew had gone to bed. I was adamant that he hadn't, and insisted that we walk over to the beach to join him because he must have come after us, to see the stars or look at the water or whatever the hell people do on the beach at 11 o'clock at night. My dad obviously thought I was crazy, but he followed anyways as I led the way over to the water. We walked up the path, through the tall grass, and out onto a completely empty stretch of rocks met by eerily calm water. To this day, part of me still thinks this was an elaborate joke done by my dad and Drew to scare the shit out of me. In which case it definitely worked, and props to them for the commitment. Technically, he could have looped around and sprinted back through the trees at our campsite without me ever seeing him. Like I said, the campground was empty most of the time aside from us, so he wouldn't have disturbed anybody. The other part of me remembers how, when that thing turned around, everything but its head was facing away from me before it seemed to remember that its head was supposed to turn too. And it snapped around lightning quick, all without ever losing that fucking smile. And that's the part of me that thinks, yeah, okay, probably not. This is the last one I'll tell you for now, and it happened 2 summers ago. We had just put the final touches on the house, bringing in the dishes and whatnot, and after an unfortunate incident during which we sat down for dinner and realized there was not a single plate to be found in the entire house, and we're staying there for the rest of the week before heading back home that Sunday. There was a whole crowd of us in one small house, so everyone spread out all over. Violet and I were sharing the very top room, which everyone referred to as the loft, even though it wasn't technically a loft. And there was actually a loft just down the stairs and to the left. The layout of the house is actually kind of important here, so I'll explain it as best I can. At the very top is the loft, which is actually a small bedroom at the highest point of the house. There are stairs leading down from that room to a catwalk, which looks down on the living room kitchen area below. The catwalk leads to the actual loft, which holds a bunk bed and a couple closets. Turning right at the end of the catwalk will take you down to another short set of stairs to the landing, where there's another room and 2 bathrooms. One more set of stairs leads down to the living room and the kitchen. Anyway, it was some unthinkable hour of the morning that normally I would have no trouble sleeping straight through. For some reason, I woke up. Have you ever been dreaming really heavily, and when you wake up, it's almost like you were just slammed back into your bed, like you'd fallen from the sky? That's how I woke up. My chest felt heavy with dread, the way it usually does after a nightmare. I could feel my heartbeat thudding along slow and syrupy. I looked to my right, expecting to see Violet passed out beside me, but she wasn't there. I sat up, looked straight ahead, and jumped. Violet was standing at the foot of my bed, right in front of the window, blocking the faint light from outside, so that she was barely a silhouette in the blurry darkness. My vision is shit without my glasses on. She was looking at me completely devoid of expression, her eyes flat, and her mouth slack. Her hands hung at her sides, but one of them was open as if she'd been reaching for something. Her fingers splayed. Like I said, my glasses were off, so I genuinely don't remember if I saw this or if I imagined it. At first I thought her hand was twitching, but as I squinted and looked closer, it was less like the hand itself was moving and more like something was writhing and pulsating beneath her skin. "What are you doing?" I mumbled, still half asleep, and more than a little unnerved. Without taking her eyes off of me, she reached for the door with a partially open hand and fumbled for the door handle. Her fingers moved weirdly, as if her hand had fallen asleep in that position, and she hadn't gotten the feeling back in her fingertips yet. She left the door wide open when she left. I sat there, with my heart still pounding as I gradually woke up. My brain was already filling in the gaps with logic. It was late. She was tired. I was tired. It could even be sleepwalking. She came back in the room a few minutes later, and there was an immediate shift in energy. You know, when something weird has happened, and it's like the air itself gets heavier, almost harder to breathe? As soon as she walked back inside, shutting the door this time, it felt easier to breathe again. She must have sensed the change in the atmosphere, because she gave me this odd look as she climbed back into her bed. "You okay? You seem to be way too relieved to see me." By that point, I think I already knew what was going to happen, but it still caused an awful sinking in my chest as I asked her why she had been acting so strange when she left the room, and watched the color slowly drain from her face. There was a moment of tense silence. Then Violet swallowed and said, "So that wasn't you on the landing?" Apparently, this is what happened on her end. She had gotten up to use the bathroom, gone down to the stairs to the landing, where she had seen me. She was understandably confused, seeing as that she had just left me lying in bed, but she wrote it off, figuring she'd been too tired to notice that I wasn't there. She had barely glanced over at me anyway, and it was dark. According to her, while I was lying in bed asleep, I had also been standing on the landing, staring straight up at the skylight above with my mouth slack and my eyes blank, one hand open and twitching weirdly at my side. Violet had said my name, and that was when whatever that thing was had turned and gone upstairs to our room. She said it wasn't until that thing passed her that she had gotten any sense that something was wrong. When it passed her, she said that there was a sharp whiff of something acrid, like old meat gone bad. And then there was also a low, garbled mumbling, but the thing's mouth never moved. I asked her if she'd seen anything on her way back up to the room, and she hadn't. To this day, I have no idea what that thing was, or where it went. These are just the stories I tend to tell people the most, around campfires or at parties, back when those were still a thing. There's a lot of weird shit that goes on this island, and I know my brother and other family and friends who have come out over the years would have some stories to tell as well. We all love the place, but we've all learned over the years that those noises in the woods are usually best left uninvestigated. That does not mean that we never go against every sense of reason and investigate them anyway. Anywho, if anyone is interested, I'd love to share more weird camping stories. It's kinda nice to get them out, honestly. And it would be cool to hear what others think about some of this stuff. Until next time, maybe.